Great. So it's a little after 11, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Archer, and I am a community program coordinator with the Heartland Environmental Justice Center. A couple of quick housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll share this out with all of the registered participants. Give us a couple days, we'll also post it publicly on the Heartland Environmental Justice Center's YouTube channel, so folks will be able to access it from there as well. We encourage you to use the chat to ask questions. My coworker, Michelle, will be monitoring that so she can make notes of things you have questions about. If there are questions that we can't answer in the moment or she can't answer quickly, we'll hold those to address at the end if there's time. And we'll also share out some important links as they come up throughout the conversation. So just watch out for that, but no, we'll put all this information into an email so you can look back at it and reference it as needed. And as I said, we set this up kind of more as a conversation, so please put yourself on mute while everyone's speaking just to avoid any disruptions, and we'll have time at the end, hopefully, for folks to come off and participate in the conversation. All right, so today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that are focused on increasing agency for community members so that they can participate in the environmental decision-making process. This is actually the second in a three-part series that's focused on civic participation in environmental justice communities. And the work of doing so in rural communities or remote communities with limited capacity is something that our center is very focused on. And a goal we have today is to make sure that you understand who you can get connected with, either through our center or through our network to support the work that you're doing. I'll share a little bit more about the HEJC in a minute, but I wanted to encourage each of our speakers to go off mute really quick to just say your name and the organization that you are representing.
Well, since I'm listed first, I'll go ahead and go first, Anna.
Yeah,
My
we could
name's
go in
Cody
order.
Smith. Yeah, thank you. My name's Cody Smith. I serve as the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Iowa Environmental Council, based here in Des Moines.
I'm Deborah Solie. I work at the Center for Rural Affairs, working on environmental challenges and local food issues.
Hi, I'm Val Ankeny, a policy associate with the Center for Rural Affairs.
I'm Tom Buller, the Executive Director of the Kansas Rural Center.
And I'm Jackie Keller, Program Coordinator for the Kansas Rural Center, mostly working on food systems.
Thank you all. So in today's webinar, we're going to be sharing an overview of environmental justice and how that can show up in rural communities. We'll also be sharing some specific tools and policy priorities from organizations who are on the call that have been working across our region on some of these issues. I also want to kind of acknowledge that while these tools that we'll be talking about and the policy priorities are focused on the specific communities in the Midwest, we want to encourage you, because I think I saw a lot of folks who maybe aren't from our region, to think about how you can learn from these tools and the work that those folks are doing to apply them in your local context. And if that's something that HEJC can help facilitate and kind of adapt with you, please feel free to reach out. So one of our goals is to make sure everyone understands who is in our network and how you can get in touch with us to work together if that's something you're interested in doing. Some quick background on who the Heartland Environmental Justice Center is. So we are the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center for the EPA Region 7. So what does that mean? We provide free custom technical assistance to communities that are advancing environmental justice and energy justice in disadvantaged communities. EPA Region 7 includes Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and adjoining Indigenous nations. So we're kind of a first-stop shop to learn about tools and resources available to you as you work to increase environmental justice in your community. We work with those who are on the call with us today, as well as a broader network of partners. We know that the Midwest has a very diverse demographic as well as geographic landscape. And so we rely on partners across the region in different states and areas to help us understand the local context of what you're dealing with, as well as provide subject matter expertise. And if you see a partner that's not listed here, but you think, would be related to the work you want to do, feel free to reach out, and it's a connection we would love to try to make. Here's a quick snapshot of the services that our organization provides. We are primarily focused on helping organization prepare and apply and manage for grants. So while that's the overarching goal, we acknowledge that sometimes that can take many different forms and it can vary in scope and scale. So if you're working with an organization that's not quite ready to do that yet, that's okay. We can meet and we can try to facilitate getting you to that step, which can require sometimes education and outreach. Maybe your community needs to be organized around a particular topic or issue. We can help develop projects as well as budgets for your grants. We can provide technical expertise and work to build networks. When you get started working with the HEJC, we just ask you to go to our contact page on our website. You fill out a quick short survey that gives us a little bit more background on the work you're doing and your organization, if it exists. Then you get assigned to a team member who processes that, asks for a call so we can learn even more. And then from there, we develop a work plan together that assigns a couple of different tasks to your project so that we can work towards measurable goals together. I'm going to pass it off now to Cody to introduce us to environmental justice topics in rural communities.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you all today, and thanks for being a part of this conversation. I'm just going to adjust my box over here so I can at least see some faces while I speak. Otherwise, I'm speaking into the void. As you were showing our logo, I just wanted to point out something that it took me a long time to learn, but you can see that the air and water and land are represented. But one of the cool things about it is if you look at it from sideways, it also spells IEC. So that's a fun fact about IEC and something that we'd like to point out with our logo. Again, my name is Cody Smith. I serve as the director of our new Climate Initiatives program here at the Iowa Environmental Council. I'll talk a little bit more about environmental justice in rural communities, but first I want to introduce you to our organization a little bit more about how we approach this work. Thank you. IEC is a statewide nonprofit organization. We do represent the largest environmental coalition in the state of Iowa. On the right side, you can see some of our staff during our conference we just had on September 24th. Some of your organizations were there, and we appreciate you being a part of that. We have a couple of key values I wanted to lift up, and that's that our work is informed by science, data, and stories. So making sure that we are basing our work and our experiences on collected information from reputable sources and from the people experiencing the conditions of Iowa's environment. Especially important for this topic today, sometimes we educate and lead on these topics using our expertise in environmental issues and policy, and other times we learn and we follow. Environmental justice is one of those spaces where we want to serve as a tool in the toolbox for communities and helping them navigate the process of identifying projects related to environmental justice in their community and accessing the resources, tools, and information to be able to get that project implementation funds or planning funds from a federal source or a non-federal source. So that's part of what we'll be talking about today. We are importantly nonpartisan and inclusive, listening to others as we do this work. And overall, our mission is to build a just, healthy environment for all Iowans and future generations to come. Next slide, please. So I think it's sometimes it's easier to start with a definition of what environmental justice is. Those of you on this call are going to be probably familiar with this definition from the EPA. I always talk about it as the fair and treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of the ways that people can be othered. So that includes race, color, national origin, and also with respect to income and other factors. Sometimes that sounds really abstract. So if you'll go to the next slide, I often talk about this from the perspective of what environmental justice is not. So I start with environmental injustice. And as I read through some of these, you might see some familiarity with how your community might align with some of these. So when we talk about environmental injustice, it's that the consequences of both climate change and environmental pollution are not felt evenly, leaving those communities that are disadvantaged by income or race or some of those other factors we just discussed, often to fend for themselves or just to have to deal with it. Some communities which are often consisting of low income and historically marginalized groups of folks, suffer those higher pollution rates. They have worse health outcomes, fewer economic opportunities, and ultimately contributes to a lower quality of life than communities that are not considered disadvantaged. We often find in a state like Iowa, and I know Nebraska and Missouri and Kansas are similar, the polluting economic activities we have, whether it's producing electricity with a coal-fired power plant or having industry that often is a heavier polluter, those facilities and activities are often located in communities that are low income, historically marginalized, and they expose those vulnerable populations of people who often have less resources to respond. And we'll talk more about that in detail in the state of Iowa. I always want to make sure that we're talking about this last point too, and it's that those communities that are often left to deal with these challenges often have less influence and resources to respond, whether that's political, social, less involvement and representation in those systems. And so those communities, I've talked about disadvantaged communities a few times. I put this graphic together because it's what the Iowa Environmental Council has used to do some research, right? I mentioned we're a little bit nerdy in this topic, and that's one of our strengths. And so we took the information from the federal government's climate and economic justice screening tool, and we complement it sometimes with the EJ screen data. You may be familiar with those tools from US EPA. And we took them and we looked at, okay, let's classify these as different types of indicators. So on the right side here, you'll see the environmental justice indicators that often speak to a lot of these existing challenges in the state of Iowa. Flood risk, expected loss of agricultural products is this expected agricultural loss rate over the next 30 years. Particulate matter pollution in the air, a proxy for air quality in a lot of cases. Energy burden, the share of your average of your income, the share of your annual income that you spend on your energy bills. So often if you get over 6% of that, you're considered to have a high energy burden. That's a big problem in the state of Iowa, particularly in rural communities actually that have often older homes with poor insulation and less efficient appliances, those sorts of things. And I actually grew up in a rural household and faced a lot of those energy and security challenges. So I know that that is something that's prevalent across the state. You take those environmental justice indicators, you pair them with the economic indicators of poverty, unemployment, annual median income, and the percent of the population that's below 200% of the poverty line, which is what the federal government uses to define a community as, quote, low income. And so we paired those together. We added in the demographic indicators of those groups that have been considered historically marginalized. For example, Black or African-American Iowans who've lived in communities like Waterloo or Cedar Falls, where they've had historic redlining, not allowing access to mortgages for homes in certain neighborhoods based on race. The percent of Hispanic or Latino residents, and then of course with our tribal neighbors here in Iowa, American Indian and Native Americans. Thank you, Anna. So I guess the point that I would make here is that this is how IEC has taken federal data and used it to define disadvantaged communities in the state. We took that, we mapped it out, and we've selected some priority communities, which is the next slide here. And those communities we identified them because they showed that they had outsized risks on each of these areas. So they stood out to us as, wow, these challenges are here. They fit these other community definitions. There are a ton of disadvantaged communities as defined by the federal government all across the state of Iowa. They typically define them at the census tract scale, but these ones really spoke to us for a number of reasons, including the ones I just outlined, but also places where we have relationships we can build upon and create new relationships with locally led organizations. So again, we can serve as a tool in the toolbox and not show up in Sioux City and say, you have this problem and we know how to fix it, but rather build relationships in Sioux City and empower folks to identify their own issues and be able to work together collaboratively to solve them. And other communities that showed up included Storm Lake, Council Bluffs, Keokuk, Dubuque, and Davenport. Doesn't mean we won't be working in those places, but we're going to start with these first 5 and then move into the next 5. Next slide, please, Anna. So I mentioned starting with environmental injustice. This honeycomb color-themed cycle here that I like to make fun of because that's all I can see when I look at it, is actually, I think, helpful for classifying and kind of laying out what this looks like. So starting in the top and center, these communities are low income with fewer economic opportunities. They have more historically marginalized and diverse communities than often the state average. They often face higher rates of air, land, and water pollution. They have more severe health impacts and worse health outcomes. They often face outsized risks of those climate impacts like extreme heat or flooding, And they ultimately are left with fewer social, economic, environmental, and political capital and resources to respond. And that's what we talk about when we talk about a frontline community, a disadvantaged community, an EJ community. Often those terms are used interchangeably, but that's what we're talking about here. And so let's make it real on this next slide with an example from Iowa. I think I saw somebody from the Meskwaki settlement on the call today, so I'm glad you're able to join us. But this is one way to talk about this. And I'll start by saying it doesn't mean that these communities are not vibrant places to work, live, and raise a family. And that's one thing I think is really important. The Meskwaki settlement's a great example. Thriving culture, lots of great things going on, a lot of fantastic people living there, raising families and doing great work. So going back to this cycle here, some areas of that of the Meskwaki settlement have up to 70% of their residents living in poverty. More diverse, again, population is 16% Native American. That's much higher than the state average. Outsized pollution, high percentage of homes that are at risk of flood within 30 years. So that's that climate risk. And then they have some of the highest rates of diabetes, heart disease, and low life expectancy for the state of Iowa. 40% of people in many neighborhoods in that area are below 200% of the poverty level, meeting that disadvantaged community definition. And ultimately, we all know, especially those of us that do rural environmental justice work with our tribal partners, know that historically, these communities have had less influence on our political system, our policy system, and have been historically treated very unfairly and violently in many cases. So that's one example of these communities in the state of Iowa in a rural context. Next slide, please, Anna. So we pulled out what some of those specific EJ indicators are in the Marshalltown area. So the 95th percentile nationally, you lay every census tract out in the United States on one scale. And this census tract in Marshalltown is in the 95th percentile for expected agricultural loss rate. It speaks a lot to some of the challenges we have here. You can see that same level of high energy burden, population loss rate, low and median household income, and then unemployment rate as well. So you can kind of see some of these trends overlapping. And we have one more example from another rural community on the next slide. And this is in Storm Lake. You can kind of see this is an aggregate indicator that's on the map here. It's the number of those EJ sort of indicators we pulled out, and we only pulled out a few of them, that they're in exceedance of what's considered the threshold for being disadvantaged. So it can be wastewater discharge, as it is here, percentage of the tract's land that's covered by impervious surfaces or cropland, and then percent of individuals below the federal poverty line and low median household income. Again, 95th, 92nd, 70th, 65th. You can see that these are real challenges in the state of Iowa. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit more about what we do here with the TICTAC and how we play the role as the Iowa-based partner. And I know the other groups on the call will talk about their roles, but I'm excited to dive into ours. So you may know this already with your involvement with TICTAC. Our ultimate goal is to help connect these disadvantaged communities with federal funding and provide technical assistance along the way. Sometimes that looks like sending them directly to HEJC. Sometimes it's us working directly with them. Maybe it's a question we can answer based on our expertise. But this strategy development and making those target communities was part of our strategy in implementing the TICTAC, to know where to start and to be able to get an understanding of where people are interested in pursuing this work, where the need is at, and how we can get the resources to the Iowans who need it most. So that's something we've been really focused on. And I'll just give one example of something that happened this last 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm really excited to share it. We hosted our first listening session in Sioux City just a few weeks ago. And this won't be in my quarterly report yet. It'll be next quarter. Sorry, Anna. But we partnered with a number of organizations, including United Today, Stronger Tomorrow, the City of Sioux City. And we had a breakout session on water infrastructure, which I happened to be able to lead. And it was a great conversation with the City of Sioux City's utility folks about their wastewater treatment facility and how it's this aging piece of infrastructure that is in desperate need of upgrades. In fact, over half of it doesn't even function anymore. And so it's becoming an economic development barrier because businesses can't ship their water there for treatment. So they have to find another way to deal with the discharge. So we worked with them to identify a FEMA program that they had already been interested in, identify a barrier that was related to something which seems completely unrelated, but the status of the state's building codes, which is they thought was an application requirement. We connected with FEMA at that listening session and asked them this question directly, and we're able to share with Sioux City that it's not a requirement, but rather a scoring criteria. So if they do well in the other areas in which they can be competitive, they can still apply for this funding. So that's an example of some of the challenges we can help you navigate as a community in the state, or even a nonprofit organization or others in the state. We have some great partners, including one I'll mention, Iowa Council of Foundations, where we have a grant writer that we help fund to be able to help your community walk through that process. And now I'm getting close to my time, Anna, so I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just the process that I just described. This bar on the bottom is the easiest way for me to understand it, and so I thought I would share that with you. We develop these relationships in communities. We're strategic in how we select those communities, as we've shown. We work together to identify funding opportunities and challenges and be supportive. If we need some help from HEJC or we don't have an answer for you, we'll connect you with them for other services they provide. And ultimately, as Anna said in the beginning, our goal is to make sure that Iowa is a competitive place to attract federal funding. Many of you probably relate to the fact that your state does not have infrastructure in place to be able to get all the things in line to get federal funds here, whether it's labor or environmental things that are stipulated in federal programs to get those dollars here. IEC wants to be the partner to build that up. So that's part of getting access to that grant writer, connecting you with HEJC, being an expert on the program requirements and how we might be able to get you connected with it. So that's often how I discuss this work. Next slide, please. So this is what hopefully, we get more of these outcomes, right? So the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act have provided already over $4.8 billion in public investments in clean energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing under the Biden-Harris administration. So this is a significant investment. What I like to point out with this map is that the blue dots are discretionary, meaning that we competed for those funds and we were able to get those. And there's a lot more green ones, which are the formula, so an allocation based on probably a local government or a statewide program that they've given it out. But my goal is to get more of these blue dots all across the state of Iowa. And we need your help to do this in rural communities and making sure that we get these resources there. So with that, I just want to say, IEC is committed to being a partner with each of you and helping usher you along in this process. If there's any questions you have about specific programs, or maybe you're not even there yet and want to access some of these tools we've mentioned to figure out what your challenges are, please reach out. My contact info, I think, if I'm guessing right, is on the next slide. Yes, okay, I got it right. So feel free to send me an email and just get the conversation started. We're happy to usher you along as far as we can. And as I mentioned, Anna and those at HEJC are willing partners to help pick that up. So yeah, I just want to say thanks. And I'm going to share a link to a civic engagement resource in particular that I didn't get around to adding to the slides, but we also track legislation during the legislative session, and we have a legislative portal. So I'll drop that link in here so you can get involved in the policy work at the state level to play your role in helping us be more competitive and impactful in these communities too. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much, Cody. Something I wanted to just add real quick is, Cody, you shared a ton of data about how we understand what environmental justice looks like in communities. So you use that, you usually use CGEST, what's known as CGEST. At the center, we also use one called the EPA EJ screen. And that's something that you can explore on your own. If you're just curious and you want to look up your own community, you can kind of find and navigate around what the indicators are for your community. That's something that we can help you with as well, is like using that map. It's a tool that's not necessarily like super intuitive. So if that's something you want support with, please reach out. And I'll also say that's something that's often required for a federal grant, is that you would provide a project map of where you're working, especially if it's environmental justice focused. And if you look at that and you see, you're surprised that you don't qualify as disadvantaged or having high environmental justice indicators, still reach out to us. We understand that data cannot possibly capture everything, and there's a lot of nuance once you get on the ground. So our team, wants to look at those measures critically and kind of think about how it actually shows up for communities, and think critically about what that data means in the context of where you're living and working. So just want to say that about the data on the back end of EJ. Great, and so now I'm going to kick it over to the Center for Rural Affairs, who's going to start us off with some tools and strategies to increase civic participation in rural communities.
Thank you, Anna. I'm Deborah Solie, as I mentioned earlier, and Val and I will be sharing some of the work we do at the Center for Rural Affairs. But first, there was a great question in the chat. Where is the center located? We are located and headquartered in Nebraska. We also have offices in Iowa, and we do have a presence in Minnesota and South Dakota. We're a nonprofit organization, and we just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. So we're going 51 years strong, which is something we're very proud of. And we're focused solely on rural issues. And we do that in a variety of ways. But our mission is to establish strong rural communities, social and economic justice, environmental stewardship, and genuine opportunity for all while engaging people in decisions that affect the quality of their lives and the future of their communities. Next slide, Anna. So what we do, we focus in 3 areas, and that's what's on the left side of this slide. We do lending. That's primarily in Nebraska. We only do our lending and business assistance, so coaching and financing, helping people who want to be entrepreneurs, purchase homes, all of those things. That's an important part of our work. I'm on the farm and community side of one of our teams, so I work in our rural communities, helping with the civic and economic and cultural engagement, helping empower and understand what our local leadership and capacity challenges they're experiencing, and helping with beginning farmers. So really a wide range of activities. And then the third team that we have is focused on policy, and that's what my colleague Val will be speaking on, and that's the role she plays. But in that area, we champion rural voices in the state houses and on federal policies. But in this context, as a Heartland Environmental Justice Center partner, we, much like what Cody was just sharing, we are one of the representatives in Nebraska where communities can come to if they have questions, concerns. We're able to provide training on grant writing and management. We can talk to them about civic engagement and leadership development, anything from education and outreach to climate resilience and food equity and food justice. And we also can help with things like SAM.gov challenges. I was a village clerk at one time in my life, and I understand that SAM.gov has its own unique headache that comes with it. So we're able to help with those things, but there are a variety of things that you're facing as a rural community, and that's what is wonderful about the HEJC. There's the base of HEJC, what Anna and others are doing, and then there's the many partners who have so much expertise that you can draw on. So know that there is a whole network available to you to help support you in whatever challenge you might be facing. Next slide, Anna, please. So at the Center for Rural Affairs, I'm going to focus today on our work in the policy realm and advocacy efforts. So we do work at the federal, state, and local levels. And I'm going to start at the local level because that's where I do a lot of our work. So we engage with local community leaders. That means going into the communities and listening and talking to those who are already know what the issues are, and maybe they just don't know what to do or how to raise their voice, and helping provide education, helping provide support, or maybe they just don't have capacity, so they just need somebody to go out and ask a question that they just literally don't have time to pick up the phone and do because their day is so full. That is something that we can do, is just add a little bit of capacity to their day and help them understand that as a group and finding partners within your community, identifying who your leaders are, all of those things are ways that you can raise awareness of challenges and work together to make a difference. So that's something that we do at a local level. At state level, we work with engaging with legislators, and that does happen in all 4 of the states I mentioned. We work in Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and South Dakota. And we are focused solely on rural initiatives. And what we do as part of that is inform community members so that if there's an issue that directly impacts a community member and they're interested and excited about and want to call there, and Val will talk more about how they can contact and what that looks like, then they can be active and take action either for or against whatever that initiative might be during that legislative session. And then at the federal level, we focus on the Farm Bill. There are a variety of different ways and different issues that impact rural life. So you might be interested in something that's beyond the Farm Bill, and we can talk about that. But in our world, we focus on the Farm Bill platform, and that has been challenging if you've been following that right now. That is an ongoing issue, but we work within those areas and helping ensure that certain aspects of rural life are included and acknowledged within that Farm Bill. And then once it's passed, we help with ensuring that it's being implemented correctly. Next slide, please, Anna. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Val, to share about our priorities.
Hi, I'm Val Ankeny, and I will be sharing a bit about the center's policy priorities. My work at the center focuses on connecting rural communities to federal funding opportunities through outreach, education, and technical assistance. We create resources to share and collaborate with communities interested in applying for funding. The center's policy priorities are shaped by the center's mission that Deborah shared. We focus our policies around energy and climate, farm and conservation, health and family well-being, and rural development. We advocate for policies that facilitate solutions for climate change and expand renewable energy development. We advance policies that facilitate economic opportunity for family farms, beginning farmers and ranchers, and farmers of color. We advocate to expand rural access to healthcare and to support a healthy living environment and improve availability of and access to healthy foods. And we work to win funding to support rural small business development. I've mentioned advocacy many times, so I want to go into more detail about what advocacy is. Advocacy is a process of influencing key decision makers in our political system and being part of the political process. Everyone is impacted by policy decisions, and each individual can impact policy decisions by being an advocate. The basis of advocacy is connecting with people and building relationships. So how can we be a rural advocate? One way is to make your voice heard. Call, email, or write your elected officials. If you want to advocate on federal policy, you would contact a federal representative. You can search how to find my federal representative and find a house.gov/representative site where you enter your zip code, and based on your zip code, your congressional district representative information will be provided. At the state level, you can connect with your governor or state senator or state representative from your legislative district. You would search for your state and legislature. Each state site is a bit different, but for Nebraska, it is nebraskalegislature.gov. If you want to create change in your local community, you need to influence local decision makers. Often you can search for the city and state, and then at the website, you find a government tab that lists boards and commissions. Before you contact an elected official, you want to map out the message you would like to share on a specific issue. Develop a rough outline of the topics important to you and write down a few main points you want to deliver. These can be your reference points if conversation moves away from your issue. It's important to tell your story. You want to share why this issue is important to you. Make sure your representative hears how this issue has affected you and those close to you. Provide data points if relevant. Be sure to display confidence, credibility, enthusiasm, and commitment. If making a phone call, begin by introducing yourself, including where you live and what you do for a living. Next, ask to speak with the legislator or his or her assistant. Share the information you prepared and be receptive to follow-up questions. Feel free to share your passion on the topic. Attending a community meeting allows you to see your representative in action and helps you gain understanding of where he or she stands on the issues. These meetings are often in question and answer format. Be sure to develop a question ahead of time. Email is usually the easiest way to contact an elected official, but can be less effective than a phone call or face-to-face interaction. Provide the same information you would in a phone call. Use email to deliver your concerns and ask a few questions. You can also share with the media. Sharing perspective through a letter to the editor or opinion piece not only influences your elected officials, but others in your community as well. Keep words to a minimum and remember to be persuasive. We have staff at the center who track the legislative sessions and send updates periodically during the session. If you're interested in more advocacy tips or receiving these updates and alerts, you can sign up for our newsletter and email alerts at cfra.org/advocate by finding the subscribe now box at the bottom of the page. Advocacy actions create change. The people you are reaching out to are elected officials, and in order for them to be elected or stay in office, they need your vote. As your representatives, it is their job to shape policy on behalf of your interests. Your advocacy ensures your voice is heard on the issues that matter most to you. And now I'll turn it back over to Deborah, who will share a little bit more about a few of our resources.
Absolutely. Thank you, Val. Yes, raise your voice, take advantage, share your passion. That's what we really want to see and make a change. And we're here to help. And I hope that's what you really take away. And Val does an excellent job of sharing those resources. And so on our website, these are some resources we have through Center for Rural Affairs. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see Rural Resources. That's our website. And this is anything from some advocacy tips. There's some links through there, but also some information that you're thinking, okay, so I don't know what to do about this challenge. Maybe I need a solution. Maybe I need to start thinking, or maybe I need a grant to help me reach or to help with this, or maybe I need to talk to my legislator about grant opportunities or what do they offer. Val does grant spotlights, and that have come out through the federal government through recent legislation, and those can be found through this website. She's trying to find ones that are easy to understand, and she tries to pull out ones that have helpful information, just easy to look at, easy to see if it applies to you or not. And there's also some resource lists there, grant writers, if you're interested in a grant writer, application guide, others. I mentioned sam.gov. So this is more of a capacity issue for those folks that are on the call. We have helpful sam.gov tips on there in English and Spanish. So that's another option for folks that are looking. On the left side of the page, I did want to mention that our map, so similar to what Cody has talked about, we did map out Nebraska using CGIST and EJ Screen. So if you see a county that is in red, that means that according to CGIST, it's disadvantaged or under-resourced. And that is an area that we are targeting for sending out resources as we hear about them. And that's the newsletter that you see below, the Community Resource Roundup. We send that out monthly, and it has information and tools as well. So if that's something you're interested in receiving, please let us know. You can go to the cfra.org/rural resources. There's contact information there, and you can let us know. We'll also put our emails in the chat. I do also want to mention the EJ Screen is the blue dots on the map. That's anyone with a 90% or higher indicator on an EJ Screen. So those are the ways we have identified who receives the Community Resource Roundup, but anyone can receive it that would like to. So those are just some additional resources. We hope this has been helpful, but please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deb and Val. I was going to add that in some of the work that we've been doing in rural communities, this is kind of related to the advocacy information that Val shared. Something that we often hear is that there can be a real lack of transparency surrounding the decision-making process. And so a good first step is reaching out to a partner like the Center for Rural Affairs or Heartland Environmental Justice Center, just because that starts to create, I think, more interest in the process and eyes on it, and understand that this needs to be a transparent and inclusive process. So sometimes just like involving different players and coalitions can be extremely helpful to facilitating that. So I just want to add that in the application to sometimes rural decision making and some of the challenges we've been working with communities on. Great, and I want to kick it over to the Center for Rural Affairs. Or sorry, Kansas Rural Center.
Hi, yeah. Again, I'm Tom Buller with the Kansas Rural Center. I'm going to provide just a little bit of overview of our organization and some background. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jackie Keller, to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing around environmental justice and food systems. And then I'll talk about some other, rural issues that are pertinent in Kansas. And close out with some resources. So to start off with, the Kansas Rural Center is an organization. We're not quite as old as the Center for Rural Affairs, so we're 45 years old this year. So we've been around a little while, but our mission is to use research, education, and advocacy to support economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just food and farming system. So while we do engage on sort of a broad scope of rural issues, food and farming is really our central concern. And we think that really, reforming the food and farming system can provide a real solid basis for rural communities and help on the environmental issues. So we'll talk a little bit here about, some of the work we do specifically on environmental justice. And then we'll talk a little bit about policy advocacy, because that is a place that, like the Center for Rural Affairs, we focus a lot of our energy also. Although we only work at the state and federal level, we're a pretty small organization and just don't have the capacity at this point to engage very much on local issues, except for helping local communities figure out, how to do things for themselves. So we can support communities, but our ability to engage is pretty limited. So I will pass it over to Jackie as we go to the next slide.
Hi. Yeah, so food insecurity is a topic that may not be as commonly thought of as environmental justice in rural areas, but it is a very serious issue, and it does qualify for much of the environmental justice funding. So I've laid out here the 3 categories defining rural in Kansas based on how many people per square mile. And these are classifications by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. So, of course, income is a big contributing factor for food insecurity. And so the SNAP program that you've probably heard of, formerly known as food stamps, is really a critical program for rural areas. But there's barriers to applying, just a basic lack of awareness about the program, certain eligibility requirements. In fact, Kansas has more restrictions than most states dealing with child support cooperation, for example. There's just general confusion about the program too, and then shame and stigma for, for immigrants, a lack of trust or the confusing regulations that go along with it. But despite these barriers, nationwide, SNAP has more than 2 times the impact on rural communities and rural economies. Okay, next slide, please. So you probably heard of a food desert, or more recently, food apartheid, which is limited access to affordable, nutrient-dense foods, where a grocery store is 10 or more miles from a rural community. And we've seen a lot of rural grocery stores close all across America. But just in Kansas alone, we've seen 105 grocery stores close in a 10-year span between 2008 and 2018. And out of these affected communities, only half were able to fill in that gap. Dollar Generals can fill in or attempt to fill in these gaps, but they're fringe stores. They don't offer SNAP benefits, and their produce is, lacking. It's not typically as fresh as local produce. And then more importantly, they affect local businesses, being able to thrive in those communities as well. And next slide, please. So other barriers can include transportation, delivery. If folks are lucky enough to have a farmer's market or a grocery store in their community, the transportation to get there may still be an issue, especially if they're elderly or disabled. During COVID, we saw the universal free school lunch program was a big help, but after COVID, that ended. And then the technology that goes along with retailers being able to get SNAP authorized and the cost that goes along with that. But one of the programs for SNAP recipients is Double Up Food Bucks, where folks can get double the amount of produce with their SNAP benefit. And a separate program is called Simply Produce. We've seen a few grocery stores across Kansas implement this, where a bundle of produce can be bought for $15 or $1 a pound. And then there's mobile pantries and markets and food banks. An exciting program that we have gotten more involved with is the Farm to School program. And that's a federal program, but the Kansas Rural Center works with the Department of Education on educating producers on how to sell to schools. And we have several videos listed on our website, starting with just the basics, what is Farm to School, and then more detailed videos, including for, specific to producers. And I'll talk to farm to food banks in the next slide. But I definitely want to mention Mobile Market first. Common Ground is the name of the super group in the Wichita area, and they're a group of people of color. They've been able to get a mobile market going, and they of course focus on or cater to Wichita, but they also are able to make deliveries in rural areas as well. And they mostly deliver to senior centers who can use their vouchers to buy produce. And their website is on the door there if you want the picture of the door, if you want to learn a little bit more about everything they do, including growing the food themselves. And then the Kansas Farm to Food Banks legislation is something that just got passed in this recent session this year, where the Kansas Rural Center was really instrumental in getting the legislature to add $900,000 to this program. And it's really important to that it focuses on local grown food, which means fresher and more nutritious options to help combat these food deserts in the rural areas. And next. So the Rural Grocery Initiative is really an excellent resource. They're based in Kansas State University, but they operate across all of rural America. Just in Kansas alone, they help 200 grocery stores in rural Kansas. And I've got a link to an article there that I wrote for our newsletter about the Rural Grocery Summit that is just packed full of incredible information for rural communities who not only are wanting to get a new grocery store, maybe to fill a gap where a store closed, but also just for grocery stores to maintain, to meet their bottom line and to be able to just stay stay in business. And then also they work with transitioning grocers for the next generation to take over that market. So really an excellent resource. And a case study here is in St. Paul, very rural community in Southeast Kansas. You can see by the demographics here how rural they are, but they were able to use an alternative ownership model, community owned. And I believe they use the co-op model. And those different models are laid out on the Rural Groceries website through the webinars that they've done. And those are really excellent, an excellent resource. And lastly, my last slide, we work with the 4 tribes in Kansas with the, it's called the Kansas Alliance for Tribal Community Health, where we help with the annual Tribal Health Summit. And we specifically work with Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation as part of their food network. And we partnered with them mostly last year on what's called Rural Cinema, Environmental Justice, where film screenings are used to engage the community in to just talk about these issues and then actions they can take as well on climate change. We showed youth versus gov for the youth workers the summer before last. And then we talk about food sovereignty after relevant food screenings, and then also water quality, which is an issue with their Soldier Creek, their watershed getting silted in. So that leads us to Tom to talk more about water and other environmental justice issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. I'm gonna go a little bit maybe to left field here and just talk about some of the environmental justice issues facing rural Kansas that are tied into agriculture. And so this first slide I've got here is just a demonstration over time of the loss of streams in western, mostly in the western part of the state. And if we go to the next slide, we'll maybe they didn't get reordered there. We'll see here on this slide that there is, yeah, thank you.
Which one you want? Okay.
Yeah, I thought I switched them. Maybe I didn't get that done. Most of, I guess, the blame for those streams drying up, certainly climate change is having an impact on that. But a lot of that comes from water use through irrigation. So agriculture has a big role in this. And if you go to the other slide that we were just on, that one, yeah, you can see that this really impacts communities across the state. So these are communities, so that's just the western 2/3 of the state. That's not the full state of Kansas there in the map. But due to groundwater issues primarily, surface water a little bit also, these communities all across the western part of the state, their water supply is at risk. And in addition to maybe not having enough water because the groundwater is getting pumped out, the other challenge is nitrate pollution in a lot of these communities. So a number of these are very small communities that have, probably their municipal water system is a few wells. As those wells get contaminated with nitrate, the only options they have are, drill a deeper well that isn't contaminated yet, or spend a ton of money to get water purification that can deal with that nitrate added into their system. So that's a real environmental impact, that's tied in with agriculture, which often is a little hard to deal with on some of these because it's often what we call non-point source pollution. But the practices that are happening are having a real impact on these communities. And of course, like many of these other problems, the problems kind of are worst in the communities with the fewest resources to respond to those. So we work trying to help people find solutions when in the agriculture in the region. How can farmers do better and pollute less, use less water, but also we field calls from communities who are struggling with this among other situations and looking for help. So the HEJC is a nice place to be able to connect folks. If you go to the next slide, then, yeah, one of the other real challenges on the landscape is the increasing proliferation of confined animal feeding operations. These have really taken off. So I said a lot of agriculture is non-point source pollution. Well, these can be a very decided point source of pollution, but they have dramatic impacts on communities, and they're increasingly, spreading, I guess, to rural communities across the state. And that's another situation we've had people reach out for help on. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, this is just a real quick note, but those feedlots, a lot of the western half of the state population loss, actually a lot of the state, not just the western half, population loss is a big issue. But there are some growing communities, and that's often where a lot of those feedlots and things are sited, and those often tie into very high immigrant populations. There'll be immigrants working in the meat processing factories. And so like a lot of these communities are heavily impacted, and, environmental justice, I guess, issues that we are working to try and connect with folks and help them work on those struggles. If you go to the next slide, I'll be really quick here. This is a long list of different groups that we engage with. So we do quite a bit of policy advocacy at the state and federal level, and we do almost all of that with coalitions. So we work with a lot of different folks, and we have what's called the Food and Farm Coalition here at the Kansas State House, and other sort of partner organizations we work with. At the national level, we are, or I guess at the regional level, we're in a group called REAMP, which works on eliminating carbon emissions, but has a real big focus on CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. And then at the state level, we work with the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. Go to the next slide. Yeah, and these are just a bunch of resources. So we do have a newsletter. We do an email newsletter that often has information about grants and things like that comes out once a month. We do a print newsletter a couple of times a year. And then during the Kansas legislative session, we do a weekly policy watch of things happening at the Kansas State House. So if you go to our website, you can sign up for all of those things, especially if you're in Kansas and interested in what's going on at the State House. I think Policy Watch is a great tool, really focused on environmental and agricultural issues. But yeah, we work with a lot of other groups, and really on some of these issues, like Social Responsible Agriculture Project, a great partner on CAFOs. And there's some REAMP CAFO resources there too. So a lot of great tools out there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to transition now to a couple more resources focused broadly on rural environmental justice issues and capacity building. I just want to clarify for folks, we do have another half hour. If you have to hop off on the hour, that's totally fine. But if you could stay with us, we have a little bit more time. So just a quick kind of overview of the funding landscape. Cody shared there is a lot of federal funding right now for environmental justice challenges. And that's where we can support, especially organizations with limited capacity, to apply. There is a really great opportunity that we're learning more about that will come out hopefully in the next month or so. And folks have already kind of been hearing about it because it is starting to be released in different EPA regions, but it is not yet out in ours. So EPA Region 7, which is Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and our adjoining indigenous nations, our opportunity is not yet released, so do not worry. We will be sharing more as it becomes available. But what we do know about this grant is that because of the way it's set up, it's going to have funding, which is kind of funneled through a selected entity, which for Region 7 is the Resource Triangle Institute. It will really remove a lot of the barriers and make for a much more streamlined application process. So we expect it to be a lot simpler and more inclusive. And will allow folks to really draw down federal funds without the typical administrative burdens of federal funding. So be on the lookout for more information about that as it comes out. We do know there's going to be 3 tiers for funding, assessment, planning, and development, as well as a non-competitive grant opportunity. And the funds range from about $75,000 to $350,000. And I think that the kind of the bigger the project, if it's a implementation project, like that's about a 2-year timeline, some are just 1 year. So we'll be sharing more. The best thing that you can do right now is sign up to receive emails from the Heartland Environmental Justice Center so that you can just be the first to know about that opportunity and the tools that will be available to you to apply. Another really great resource just to get familiar with and to create an account is grants.gov. I suggest you do that with the federal grant application guide that the Center for Rural Affairs mentioned. That really helps walk you through how to understand grants.gov as a resource. It breaks down some of the terminology and systems, so it just becomes kind of a nice guide as you're looking through that. And I just mentioned here where we can see sometimes pools of funding focused on remote tribal and rural communities are USDA, EPA, DOE. There are, of course, others, but it's not a bad idea if you're really focused on getting funding right now to sign up for some of those emails. I know it can become very overwhelming, but that's just a good way to stay in the know about what's opening and kind of familiarize yourself with some grant cycles. Another, I think, accessible potential funding resource is the Rural Climate Partnership. They do have an open letter of interest process, so anyone can go learn more and submit what their funding needs are, and then be asked to submit a bigger application for specific funding needs. And then just to develop relationship with your local community foundation. If they don't have funding, they might know others in your area that could support your work. And then a couple other opportunities that are not funding related that I just wanted to buzz through quickly. One is called the Community Toolbox, and this is a resource through the University of Kansas that has very accessible videos, language, and processes to influence community change. So it's very focused on taking action in your community and how you do so in a variety of settings. And I actually used this recently myself to work with the community to understand how they could get funding on at the state level as a line item. And so it was a really great way, like we at the HJC were working across so many different states. It was a great way for me to plug in and understand, it broke down what's happening at the state level across the country. And just, I thought it was very easy to understand and then to apply to the specific issue we were working on. So it's a vast resource, and you can kind of use it to search for what you're looking to understand better, and how to move through that process from a civic perspective. The rural, we also talk about, getting involved in different leadership development programs. There are some that are quite focused on rural leadership development. There's one, if you're familiar in Kansas, the Kansas Leadership Center, they're doing some work focused on rural communities, or they can you can take their tools and apply them to the work that you're doing locally. Another example in Nebraska is Common Ground. We try to keep a list of all of those opportunities. So if you're interested in something like that, just reach out. We might be able to find something that we could plug you into to meet folks who you could organize with, or kind of share the work that you're doing with, at least to have someone so you're not alone. And then another interesting and, sounds kind of maybe off topic resource is the Resource Rural, which is a storytelling platform. It is a great website where they are trying to capture stories of communities that have been successful at drawing down federal funds to solve critical climate issues. And they're really trying to display how small towns with limited capacity have been able to do so, and kind of what that process is. So it's a great way to kind of look at and try to find things that you might see your issue in and try to learn from. So there's also a page there that you might be able to submit, I think, a story of your own to try to just use that to draw more attention to your issue, and get some support in that aspect of your work. And the last thing I'll say is the Rural Community Assistance Program, which is a big network of training and technical assistance organizations. So it's just another kind of good first stop to look for other organizations that could support you. So I want to pause there and just see if there's any questions. Michelle, I don't think there's been any yet in the chat that we haven't been able to respond to, but if anyone wants to ask specific question to one of our